Luma and the dawn paths of Tsukiji. Luma reached the market at the hour when night loosens its hold and the first soft colors begin to think about morning. The streets near Tsukiji still carried a quiet that felt respectful, as if the city had placed a cushion under every sound. Lanterns blinked in doorways and steam rose from pots that told gentle stories in little puffs. She walked along a lane where crates slept in tidy stacks and where a broom leaned with the calm patience of someone who knows there is time. Tsukiji welcomed her as if it had been waiting for a listener rather than a guest. She stepped through a Noran curtain that moved as softly as a breath and found a narrow lane lined with tiny shops, each with its own mood. In one window knives lay on blue cloth like quiet moons, their edges asleep but full of promise. A shopkeeper held a whetstone in a bowl of clear water and skimmed a blade across it with a long slow whisper that sounded like calm rain sliding down a roof. Across the lane a woman opened a case of tea leaves and the air became green and toasty and bright. Bundles of kombu rested like rolled maps of a sea she had not yet sailed, and nearby a mountain of katsubushi looked like small pieces of sunrise petrified into fragrant wood. Luma paused to read hand-written signs that offered guidance in careful ink, and even the letters seemed to breathe. Beyond the knives and tea, a stall displayed porcelain bowls with glazes the color of river stones. The merchant set one bowl in her paws for a moment so she could feel its balance, and it sat there as if the air under it had learned to be tender. Another stool presented towels printed with waves and cranes, and a third held baskets of pickles that shone like tiny lanterns inside their jars. A pair of apprentices moved past carrying boxes full of ice, and the ice rattled like a pocket of friendly bells. As the light grew, more shutters slid open and the lanes filled with a human tide that understood how to flow without pushing. Carts moved with a small electric hum and hand trolleys threaded easy lines between stalls. Everywhere she looked she saw hands working with a rhythm that made her ears rest. Large blue tubs brimmed with silver fish that glowed under a skin of water and ice, and smaller trays offered clams with shells like folded fans. Sea urchins rested like little suns turned inward. A fisherman lifted a tuna steak that looked smooth as marble and set it down with the care one gives to a sleeping child. Luma watched a chef choose pieces for breakfast and thank each vendor with a bow that happened as naturally as breath. She followed the current toward a cluster of places that promised morning meals. A chef with a soft voice pressed rice that smelled faintly of vinegar into an oval cushion and laid upon it a slice of fish so luminous it seemed to carry its own little dawn. Luma sat at a counter and the stool accepted her weight politely. A cup of bright tea came to her paws and the warmth traveled inward like a gentle tide. She tasted a mouthful of tomigoraki that held sweetness and light, and then a piece of salmon that remembered the clean side of the ocean. Each bite used simple words and spoke them perfectly. The chef set miso soup beside her and the surface quivered with a few green islands of scallion. When she lifted the bowl, a cloud of comfort rose, and the whole of Tsukiji seemed to inhale with her. After breakfast, she drifted into a corridor where tarps were still folded and where the concrete floor held maps of earlier puddles. An old sign on a pillar listed hours from a different decade and wore them with the ease of a well-made coat. She found a doorway that looked out to the water and watched gulls make tidy pencil marks across the pale sky. The tune traveled along the buildings and settled among the ropes and poles, and when it finished, the silence tasted like the best part of the song. She returned to the outer market where the lanes grew cheerful. Stacks of citrus glowed like waiting suns. Bundles of green onions stood like little forests. Vendors called softly to one another and sometimes to the morning itself. A skillet hissed as scallops met butter and soy, and the smell found its way into the dream she keeps just behind her eyes. Nearby, a woman whisked matcha until the surface gathered a fine foam that reminded Luma of the top of a friendly wave. At a stall of seaweed and dried goods, the merchant showed Luma sheets of nori held to the light to display the pattern of their hidden weave. Jars of yuzu marmalade glinted like captured morning. She sampled tiny squares of tofu flavored with herbs and smiled, which made the merchant smile, which made the day lean toward warmth. At the end of a lane where fewer people walked, she discovered a tiny shrine tucked between two buildings. A pair of stone guardians kept watch with the confidence of old friends. She washed her paws at a basin, lifted her face, and breathed. The rope of a bell hung within reach, and she touched it gently so the bell spoke a single syllable that blessed the air rather than shook it. She closed her eyes and asked for nothing compared to the clean simplicity of the moment, and the shrine seemed pleased to be appreciated rather than required. When she opened her eyes, the market had taken a deeper color. Steam floated from a small stall that prepared broth the shade of amber. Thin flakes of katsuobushi rose and fell on a bed of rice like a gentle breeze passing above an autumn field. A vendor arranged eggs into neat rows the way a poet arranges lines to help a reader breathe. Another lifted a sheet of kelp, inspected it as if reading a letter from the sea, and placed it in a tray with a nod that said, "Yes, I understand." A young man rolled tomagoyaki with movements that belonged to long practice and good days. Customers thanked him with little bows that said, "We will return." In a corner near wooden pallets, she watched the quiet industry of cleaning and setting. Water flowed from a hose and wrote bright lines across the floor. Scrub brushes talked to the concrete and the concrete listened. Empty foam boxes were stacked into towers that looked like temporary mountains made of cloud. A dog trotted past with a serious face and a tail that could not help conveying joy. Someone whistled again, and the dog turned the sound into a circle through the air. Luma breathed and imagined placing each small scene into a pocket of memory where it could be taken out on nights that needed comfort. At a stall with a little grill, the cook invited her to try a small skewer of eel glazed to a thoughtful shine. The bite filled her with a steady happiness, as if a warm hand had pressed gently on her shoulder. An older woman saw her pleasure and gifted her a slice of tamago as a bonus for bright eyes and good manners. Luma thanked her with a nod and the woman waved it away like a mild breeze. Down the lane a group of students practiced greetings in careful voices, and an instructor shaped their sounds with patience until each one bowed with both word and posture. This chorus of learning blended with the sizzle of grills and the whisper of knives and the soft rumble of trolleys, and everything together made a lullaby for anyone who needed one. She wandered to a stall of ceramics where deep bowls looked capable of holding both soup and kindness. The potter let Luma tap a rim and the note rang pure and short like a soft bell that knows its role. Next she paused at a place where tenagui hung like flags of simple joy. Patterns of fish and waves and birds and lattice moved slightly in the air. A young artist sat on a stool and drew with a brush that made each line look like it had always wanted to be that line. Luma watched a heron take shape on cotton and felt a little hush collect inside her chest. At another stall a woman shaped rice into triangles and wrapped them in nori sheets while answering questions with the dignity of a small teacher. The fillings were simple and perfect. Pickled plum, salmon, seaweed cooked until it tasted like memory. Luma ate one slowly by a doorway while workers balanced boxes on small carts and moved like water around a rock. She thought about how places can be wide as skies and also as precise as the inside of a teacup. Tsukiji seemed to understand both. Mid-morning arrived like a long exhale. The lanes grew bright with the confidence of a day fully awake. A call went up for fresh fruit and crates opened with friendly groans. Peaches blushed in their paper cradles. Apples stacked themselves as if pretending to be a small hill. Yuzu glowed with a gold that the eye could touch. Near the entrance a florist trimmed stems with a snip that sounded polite. She placed lilies and chrysanthemums in buckets where water took their shapes gladly. The scent joined the salt air and the faint sugar of pastries and made a soft chord that filled the whole market. Luma made her way toward a cafe that held only 6 seats and a wooden clock that refused to hurry. The owner set a cup of barley tea before her and spoke of mornings long past when trucks lined the lanes before sunrise. He did not speak with regret. He spoke with the ease of one who knows that places change and yet keep a spirit if someone remembers the correct way to walk. They watched together as a boy returned a borrowed cart with care, and the owner smiled because good habits are a form of music. The sunlight came more boldly now and made clean shapes on the water. A man practiced Tai Chi near the railing and each movement seemed to iron the air. Luma mirrored one slow breath of that practice and felt each pore grow lighter. Back inside the maze of lanes, she discovered an alley where the rhythm dropped to a hush. An elderly couple mended nets with needles that moved like tiny fishes. They spoke to each other with glances that carried whole paragraphs. A radio now played a tune from many years ago and the melody leaned against a pile of baskets with a friendly sigh. Luma stepped carefully so as not to disturb the invisible sentences in the air. She thanked the couple with a little bow, and their eyes smiled even before their mouths joined. At a counter where miso stood in cedar tubs, the clerk offered a tasting on the tip of a wooden spoon. One miso tasted like a cold evening that becomes a warm room. Another tasted like a field after rain. He described the fermentation as a slow conversation, and she understood that all the best foods are forms of listening. She bought a small packet to tuck into her scarf, not for weight but for the companionable idea of it. Yuzu peel, green pepper, sesame with salt. Near noon the market reached a lovely balance. Tourists passed with bright eyes, yet their voices stayed kind. Workers moved with the relaxed focus that comes when good routines meet good moods. The air shimmered with grill smoke and tea steam, and a brightness that came from many eyes noticing small pleasures. Luma paused at the threshold of a busy stall and let the flow make its own decisions without her. A vendor offered her a seat and a bowl of clear soup that held 3 clams like little boats. She felt ready to carry a private pilgrimage into the heart of the outer streets, so she turned into a seldom-used lane and moved as quietly as curiosity would allow. There she found a wall of old posters that had faded into peaceful versions of themselves. In one poster a fisherman laughed with a net over his shoulder. In another a child ate ice cream with the determination of a poet writing a final line. The posters held the history of many mornings without asking anyone to be nostalgic. They simply stayed and weathered and became soft. Luma let her eyes rest on them until memory and imagination shook hands. As she circled back toward the central lanes, she noticed that the voices had taken on a restful cadence, the sound of a place that knows it has done good work for the day. A bell rang from a bicycle and the rider raised a hand in apology and the pedestrian raised a hand in forgiveness, and the market nodded in approval. A woman laughed at something her friend said about a stubborn pot lid, and the laughter rolled along the lane like a warm wave. A man set a fresh banner on a pole and the cloth climbed the air with the confidence of a bird that trusts its wings. These small acts wove themselves into a cloth of calm that covered the shoulders of the market. She took a final walk through the knife shop where the blades now gleamed with a quiet that looked like relief. The shopkeeper told a story about the oldest knife on the shelf and how it had seen 3 owners and learned to cut in 3 slightly different ways. The story made the knife seem like a dignified elder. Luma thanked the shopkeeper and the whetstone and the bowl of water and the cloth, and in response the shop felt a little warmer though nothing had moved. At the edge of the market where the streets widened, she found a bench that overlooked a small square. Delivery workers leaned on their carts and shared sips of tea. Pigeons held a meeting with no agenda. A child pointed at a vendor who juggled mandarins 3 at a time, and the child clapped when the mandarins returned safely to their crate. Luma let the square draw a circle around her, and for a while she existed only as a content dot in the middle. Time became simple again. Breath in, breath out. The square agreed and kept the beat for her. She rose and walked once more past the shrine. The bell did not need to be touched again. It spoke without speaking. The guardians watched with the same ready patience. She thanked them in silence and stepped into sunlight that had matured into a gold that belonged to kind afternoons. The alleys no longer asked for new attention. They offered a blessing for the road instead. She carried it in the easy way that a fox carries its tail, as part of herself and part of the air. On her way out she stopped at a stall that sold tiny packets of salt from different coasts. Each packet carried a memory of wind and rock and tide. The vendor said this one is from a shore that loves morning, and this one is from a shore that prefers evening, and this one is from a shore that keeps the secret of perfect naps. Luma selected the last and the vendor nodded as if she had chosen a poem. The market behind her grew quieter. Workers stacked crates in patterns that looked like cities inventing themselves. Buckets were emptied in a choreography of little waterfalls. Floor squeegees drew silver rivers that soon disappeared. A last pot of tea poured out its kindness and the kettle sighed with the superior relief of a task well completed. Luma watched a final trolley glide past and listened as its sound faded into the street like a stanza coming to rest. Outside the district she followed the river once more. A light boat crossed under a bridge and left a modest V in the water. The city beyond seemed to hold its pace at a level she could agree with. A woman on the embankment dropped bread for birds and the flock arranged itself into a quick sculpture and then dissolved delicately, leaving only the idea of wings on the air. Luma sat on a stone and removed the miso packet from her scarf and held it for a while the way one holds a note that is about to be sung. She did not sing. She let the city sing for her. When she finally rose to go she felt softer and broader at the same time, like a map that has learned to include more kindness with each new road. The day would carry her elsewhere, perhaps to a park with a quiet pond or to a side street where cats supervise a bookstore. Wherever she went she would walk at the pace that Tsukiji had given her. It was a pace that suits sleep and suits waking and suits the gentle work of remembering. She looked back one last time and the market seemed to lift a hand in a gesture that said come again when you wish and bring an appetite for small wonders. She promised that she would.